hello. How is everyone today? Doing good, I hope. Could I answer any questions for you before we get started? All right. Well, when we left off last time, we had started playing with this lightsabers example. It was a little example that I'd thrown together we could download from my website. It was essentially a fairly complete little Rails app. Nothing fancy, of course, just a basic CRUD sort of setup was what it was prepared for. But I had pulled all of the views out of it. So what we were doing was we were going through and writing the views. Since the entire back end was there, we actually do have a database support for it. All of the data about our lightsabers is stored in the database. So we have active record access, right? And what we had gotten so far was we had put together sort of what we could call the home page, basically the list or the index page that gives us a list of all of the lightsabers that are in our database. Okay. That actual page, when we put it together, the content itself was essentially just a table. Okay. Inside the table, to actually put in the lightsaber data, what we did was we have an array of all of the lightsaber active record objects that was provided to us by our controller. Right? We basically used the each iterator to go through that array, and for each one of those lightsabers we created a new row in the table with cells in it where we displayed the different attributes, the different values that are part of the lightsaber objects. We included excuse me, a little bit of logic in there. So if a lightsaber had an image associated with it, if its image field wasn't blank, then we use the image tag helper that Rails provides us with in order to actually write an image tag and display that lightsaber's image. Okay. But overall, not too terribly much there. Okay. One of the interesting little bits that we had in here was we also used the link to helper in order to create a link to go to the show page, kind of a details page, for an individual lightsaber. Right? You might remember back when we were doing PHP, in order for us to be able to do something like a details page, essentially to have one page that could potentially show the details about any object, what that page essentially needed to know was it needed to know which object from the database that it was meant to show the details for at any given particular access. So what we did was we used link to create a hyperlink. We linked the lightsaber's name, so that's the actual link text that the user will see. But then instead of us having to put together our own URL, instead of us having to manually append in an ID, one of the neat little tricks that Rails lets us do, it's actually a neat little feature of Rails's router, is that we were simply able to provide it with a lightsaber object. So lightsaber that I have right here when I'm producing this link is the same lightsaber that's being yielded here to this block by the each iterator. Right? And from having that lightsaber object, the link to operator and the router were able to automatically put together the proper URL for us. So I end up being able to click on the name of a lightsaber and it takes me over to that lightsaber's detail page. Over on the actual detail page itself, the content of that page is essentially all the different values that are provided to us in a lightsaber object. The actual retrieval of that object from the database is something that happens in the controller. So when the ID for a particular lightsaber gets passed over to this show action, it automatically pulls up, or according to what the controller says to do, it automatically grabs the proper lightsaber from the database, puts it into an instance variable for me called @lightsaber, and then I have access to that here in my view, where I can go through and display all the different values in it, including the image with the image tag helper, if it's not blank. Okay. One of the things I noticed that I wanted to put on this page that I didn't is I'd like to have a backlink, a link to go back to the list page again. So I might put in a set of output ERB tags, use the link to helper, and I'm going to link to the word back. For the actual path itself, I could manually type in a path inside quotes. Okay. But again, there's some neat little shortcuts that the Rails router will provide to us. Here, instead of putting in quotes an actual path, if I say lightsaber's path, that lightsaber's path is actually a method call that will return the proper path to go back to the list of lightsabers. If I refresh my show page now, I've got my backlink showing up down at the bottom. If I click on that backlink, it takes me back to the list page. Okay. Now, some of these neat little shortcut things, like me being able to type lightsabers path when I do a link, or on the index page being able to link to and just give it a lightsaber, those are all neat little features of the Rails router, which is something that we will definitely talk about eventually. Okay? Just can't talk about everything at once. But I thought I might mention, for the time being, that if you go out to your console, go out to a terminal, and you're in your project directory, okay, if you type rake routes, okay, what it will do is it will come back and give you a list of those little shortcuts that I'm using. Right? So if you're not sure, not certain of which ones are available, which ones exist, run rake routes, and you'll get a listing back that looks something like this. Mine looks kind of crummy because I have the size on my terminal blown up big to try and make it easier for you to see my text. If it was a little bit smaller, the lines wouldn't wrap like they are right now, so it wouldn't look quite as bad. Right? But you can see some of the things in here that I've been using, like Lightsaber. When I gave it a lightsaber, right, it was able to just find a path to the lightsaber. And over here to the side, it shows me the actual URL that equates to, /lightsabers, and then an ID. And then a little bit further over to the right still, it tells me in controller and action terms which controller and which action that particular path will activate. So when I just do lightsaber, right there, or this is the line I'm talking about anyway, where it'll actually take me is to the lightsabers controller and the show action. Right? What I just did, where I made a link to go back to the list, that was from this one right here. When I say lightsabers, plural, right, the actual URL it'll take me to is /lightsabers, which is the index action of the lightsabers controller. Right? So when we talk about routes, we'll learn what these things are, how they're put together, how to modify them, how to customize them, all that good sort of stuff. For the moment, simply knowing that they're there is more than sufficient. Okay? The leftmost column, like where it says lightsabers on that one, you'll notice that what I actually typed when I put that in was lightsabers path. You generally need to take whatever it says in that routes output and either put _URL or _path at the end of it. Okay? All right. That then ties into what it is that I wanted to work on next. Kind of the reason I wanted to start this whole lightsabers example is because I wanted to have a little bit of a framework in place so that we could look at some of the helpers that Rails provides that'll make it easier for us to be able to create forms. Right? In the case of lightsabers, we would want to create a form that would let us make new lightsabers. We would probably want to create a form that would let us edit existing lightsabers. Right? So in order to do that, over on the index page, back over on the main page of my little project, this page here, I'd like to have a link down at the bottom that I could click on that would take me to a new lightsaber page, a page that has a form on it that will let me make a new lightsaber. Right? So on the index page itself, down at the bottom below the form, I'm just going to drop in a paragraph, and in that paragraph I'm going to create a hyperlink using the link to helper. What the user will see is new lightsaber. I'll put that in as the link text. And where I want this link to actually go is to the new action of my lightsaber controller. If I go back and I look at that routes information that I was given, you'll notice that there's one in there called new lightsaber. Right? That will take me to the new action of the lightsaber's controller. So here when I do this link to, if I put in new _lightsaber _path, that should give me a link that'll go to the right place. So let's give that a try. I'll say new _lightsaber _path. When I go back to my index page in the browser and hit refresh, I do get a link down at the bottom that says New Lightsaber. And when I click on it, if you look at the URL, it's taken us to /lightsabers/new. And in the error message here, it tells me that it's looking for a new template under the Lightsabers view directory. So that's taking me to the correct place. The only problem is we haven't created the view yet. So that would be the next thing that we need to do. Right. Under the actual Lightsabers views folder, the only files we have right now are for index and for show. What we want to do there is we want to create a new file. Right. The file will actually be called new.html.erb. Its name matches the name of the controller action, new. The output should be HTML, and I'm going to use ERB in it. Use ERB to render it, to construct it, to build it, I guess would probably be the best way of saying it. So there we go. Here inside this new page, just as a comment, I'll put in the name of the file, new.html.erb. And up at the top, let me put in an H1, I'll just say New Lightsaber. If I go back to my browser and refresh again, it's now finding that template. So the error message goes away, and we've actually got a page coming up where we can now construct a form for making new lightsabers. Do you remember how complicated it was to make forms back in PHP? So many different layers of complication to it even. From sort of the simplest, like writing the HTML for a form. I don't know that I'd call writing the HTML for a form complicated, but it certainly has a certain aspect of busy work to it. Right? A lot of HTML code that has to be typed. There's the code for the actual fields themselves, whatever they may be. Text fields, buttons, radio buttons, check boxes, select boxes, all of those fun sort of things. Plus, to make them accessible, to construct it properly, generally each one of those needed to have a label tag that went along with it. Usually we would group those together inside divs or paragraphs. There's a lot of code, a lot of HTML that goes into just building a modest form. Okay? As we were creating the form itself, we had to do things like figure out what path the form was going to submit to. For each one of the separate form controls, each one of the fields in the form, we would have to decide on a name, an ID, all of that kind of business for it. And that was all just getting the form set up for the user to see it the very first time. Once the form was actually submitted, we then had to write a lot of code that would look and see if the data had been submitted. If the data had been submitted, then we had to validate it. If it had been validated, then we had to go through a routine of putting it into the proper format so it could then be stored, either in a flat file or in a database. Database in our case here, right? I think what you'll find in Rails is that it's a whole lot easier, right? Do you have a question? Okay, right? For starters, some of the things that I mentioned, like the putting it into the right format to store it, the validating it, that we know has already actually been done for us. That was all the stuff that we were talking about in Active Record. So we don't have to do anything all that special for validation. That's already done. That's done over in our model. We've already said what needs to be validated and how for our lightsabers. Right? The complication of actually seeing if data has been submitted or not, the handling of that actual submitted data, that's all actually taken care of in the controller for us. Right? It's generally not a complicated thing, and in this particular example, that code is already written. So really, all we need to do here in the view is we need to put the actual form together itself, and we need to take care of things like what happens if the form is invalid? What happens if the data is invalid? How are we going to show the user the errors in the form? Okay. And again, the cool thing about this is that Rails is going to end up doing a whole lot of this work for us. Right? It's going to make everything a whole lot easier than it normally would be. Okay? So Part of the thing that makes this so much easier than in some other setups is that Rails has a lot of helpers, a lot of different methods that we can call that write the actual HTML for forms for us. Right? Now in Rails there are, I would say, fundamentally two different types of forms you might want to write. There's a type of form that's associated with an active record object, and there's a type of form that's not. Right? Like here, for example, when we're creating a new form for a lightsaber, you can't get much more associated with an active record object than that. The form is there specifically to collect information to make an active record object. When we do our edit page, right, it'll be the same thing. Right? The edit page will have a form on it where it's meant specifically to let us edit the data in an active record object. Okay? So those would be examples of forms that are tied very closely to active record. The other type of forms that aren't tied close to active record, would be something like a search form. Right? When you put in a search form, what are you searching for? Well, it might be an active record object, but it could be many different types of active record objects, or it might be something else entirely. So something like a search form would be a form where we're not so closely tied to active record itself. So we'll do some forms of both of those two types, and we'll find that there are slight variations in the helpers that Rails provides for us, depending on whether we're working very closely with active record or not. Okay? So for starters, here in our new page, if we want to create a new form, we can do that by using a form helper called form4, called form4, a method we can call called form4. Right? There's really only one piece of information that form4 has to be given, and that is a sample of the type of active record object we want to create. So if we're going to create a form to let us build a lightsaber, then we need to give form4 a lightsaber active record object. Right? Our controller in this case is already set up to do that. If I go look in the controller in the new action, the new action in my lightsaber controller creates a brand new lightsaber, lightsaber.new, stores it in @lightsaber, so that I then have that sample of a lightsaber that I can pass to form4 so it knows what kind of active record object it is that I'm dealing with. Okay. The form4 method then takes a block form4 will then yield to the block what it refers to as the form. Usually I just put that into a variable here called f. That f object is then what we can reference inside the form whenever we want to do something with it. Right? So here with form4, it's a little bit less like we're actually building the form, and a little bit less like we're manually writing the form, and a little bit more like we are giving instructions on how to build it using that f object. Right? So inside my form here, for example, maybe I'll put in a div. I'll say it has a class of field for formatting purposes. And then in some ERB output tags, I could do something like, say, f.label, which is basically me saying, at this point, I want there to be a label added to the form. I just need to then tell the label method what the label is going to be for. And let's say that this label is going to be for the lightsaber's name. I just pass name as a symbol to the label method. How does the label method know what name is? Well, it knows what name is because it has this lightsaber sample up here, this lightsaber object, and it can look inside that object and see, okay, yes, we have a name attribute. That must be what this field is going to match up with, or what that label is going to match up with. I'll put a break after that label, and then on the next line, what I want to do is I want to put in a text field where the user can actually type in the name for the new lightsaber that's being created. Right? To do that, I just do f.textField. So the form itself has a text field method. And again, I'm going to say this text field is for the name. The text field method will be able to figure out what I mean by name because it already knows that I'm building a lightsaber. If I jump back over to my browser and hit refresh, that's what I get. The name label and the name text field. Let's see. Got to remember to find a better way to be able to show you the source code without having to go to the little inspector down there, which I know is hard to see. Well, that's what I got for right now. Okay. If we go look at the document itself at this point, right, see what Rails has built for us. It's very small down there, okay? But essentially the form itself, the opening form tag, when we called form for Lightsaber, Rails automatically created a set of form tags. It automatically filled out the form tag, the opening form tag, with all of the typical attributes you would find. It put in the correct action in order to get us to the create action of the lightsaber's controller. So essentially set the form up for us so that it's ready to create a new lightsaber. For the field I just created, you can see that it put a label in, a set of label tags in HTML, and it put in a text field. It automatically gave them both the correct names and IDs, so that essentially when we fill data in to that text field and submit it, it will automatically be in the format that the controller expects it to be in. So we didn't have to really worry about names. We didn't have to worry about putting it into the right format for the controller. By using these little helpers, that all is essentially done for us automatically. We just have to tell it essentially what fields to create and where. So I say in my form, inside a div, create a label and a text field for name first. And we can go on doing essentially the same thing. I could create another div. Inside this one, I'll create a label for the description of the lightsaber. For the description, I want the user to have more room to type than a text field, so I'm going to call the text area method. Tell it that's a text area for the description. That's all the information the form helper needs in order to create that text area correctly. Go over, refresh, and there's my new text area that's been built for me. What's the next field? The color? Yeah, let's do color next. So I'll say f.label for color. For color for right now, let's just do a text field again. Oh, that should be text, not test. So now I have a text field for color. After that, let's do dark side. Oh. F.label for dark side. For this one, I'm going to do a checkbox. Oh. Check underscore box for dark side. What's left? The image. For the image, technically we should give them a file field where they can pick an image off their system and upload it. But that gets into another level of complication. So for right now, let's just treat the image as another string, another name. We'll just give them a text field to deal with that for right now. Hopefully later we'll have the time to talk about uploading attachments and such. There are some gems available that make it actually quite easy. I'll just do it like that. If I look, I've got my checkbox for dark side there. I've got my text field for image. Basically my whole form. The only thing I'm still lacking is a submit button down at the bottom. But the form helpers take care of us with that too. I'm going to put in a div with a class of action. And for the object f, for the form, I'm going to call the submit method. Pretty smart. See the button down at the bottom, the submit button it put in? When I put in a submit button, I didn't tell it anything. I just said I want a submit button here. I didn't have to tell it what the submit button should say. But because the form is already associated with a Lightsaber object, the form helper for submit was able to do two things. One thing it was able to do was it was able to determine that the Lightsaber we have here has not previously been saved. It's never been saved. Based on that, it knows we're creating a new Lightsaber, so it used the word create on the button. And of course, it could tell that the actual name of the model is Lightsaber, so it put that on the button too. So it automatically created the text on our button for us to say create Lightsaber. If the Lightsaber that I had passed to the form for method up at the top had been a Lightsaber that already existed in the database, it would have recognized that as well, and instead of saying create Lightsaber, it would have automatically said update Lightsaber, because it would have known that was a Lightsaber that's already been created. Pretty sharp, right? So that's it. That's my whole form. Little bit repetitive, but not that bad. I would certainly rather write it this way than to have to write out all the HTML myself. Right? Those helpers have taken care of all that for me. The only other thing I might do is down here at the bottom. Oops. I want to put in a link that will take me back to the list page again in case I change my mind and decide that I don't want to actually create a new Lightsaber. So I'm going to create a link that says back that goes to the Lightsabers path, which should give me the proper URL to go back to the list page again. If I refresh my page, I get my backlink down at the bottom. If I click it, sure enough, it takes me back to the list page. If I click New Lightsaber, I've got my new Lightsaber form. Let's see if it actually works. I'm going to say I want to create a new lightsaber called Yoda. The description is going to be Yoda's lightsaber is smaller than most. For the color, green, dark side, no. The image is yoda.gif. I'll click Create Lightsaber. It did it. It created the new lightsaber, it stored it in the database. After the new lightsaber was created and stored in the database, it automatically redirected me to the detail page for the new lightsaber that had just been created. If I click back there on the detail page, I'm back at the list, and you can see Yoda's lightsaber there listed alongside the three that we had previously. What do you think? It's like magic. Or I guess actually more appropriately, it's like the Force. It surrounds us, it penetrates us, binds the galaxy together. Don't you think?
When's it let me submit the lightsaber?
Not letting you submit it. So you fill out the form.
And it just goes back to the top of the page.
Are the values you typed in still there in the fields? It sounds like it's failing some kind of validation. Did you put in the same values I did or something different?
Same thing.
Same thing. Let's see. Try looking at your server console. When you submit the data over on your terminal where the server's running, you should see something that looks a bit like this, where it says processing Lightsaber's controller create as HTML. Right? Are all the values looking like they're kind of in the proper place? It's basically just a series of hashes all set up there.
Yeah.
Nothing looks like it's going blank. Well, let me come take a look. Yeah, if you go back and you look at the model, in our model, we had a validation that was picky about the color.
Oh, the case of it?
Yeah. Here it is. Validate that the color is included in this array, and green with a lowercase g is included, but green with an uppercase g is not. So what was happening was it was failing validation, and that's why it was kicking you back to that page. So, yeah, there you go. All right, that does bring up an important point at the moment. Right? Our form does do some nice things for us. Okay? For example, if I leave a field blank, like I'll leave the name blank, if I tell it to create that, that fails validation. The fields, when it comes back and reloads the form, you notice automatically refill with our data that we had put in. Back in PHP, that was something we had to work for. Here, it just is run-of-the-mill. It just happens automatically because of the helpers. Right? But something that's not quite happening yet is it's not marking that field as having a problem. It's also not displaying any kind of error telling us what the problem is. That's something we'll come back and work on here in just a bit. Yeah. Before we actually do that, though, why don't we go ahead and knock out the edit form? Right? The edit form won't be too terribly complicated. As a matter of fact, it's going to be virtually identical to what we just did for the new form. Okay? The first thing we're going to need, though, is we're going to need a way to actually get to it. So back over on my index page, I need to put in a hyperlink that I can click for a lightsaber that will let me go edit that particular lightsaber. So up at the top of my table in the first row, I'm going to add a new table header cell up there just to keep my table square. And then down after the TD where I'm putting in the image, I'm going to put in a new TD. And in that one, what I want to do is I want to put in a hyperlink to go to the edit page. So essentially, this is going to say link to, and I'm going to put the word edit there. The magic little method that I can call, the magic little path that I can put in order to make it easy for me to get there is going to be edit lightsaber path. And what I then have to do is I have to pass that method the lightsaber that I want to edit.
Shouldn't you do add lightsaber?
We're inside an iterator here, inside each, so it's this little local lightsaber variable we're using. So back over on my index page, all my lightsabers now show up with an edit link off to the right of them. If I try to edit something like Mace Windu's lightsaber, okay, Looking at the URL, it tried to take me to /lightsaber/3, which is the ID of that lightsaber /edit, which is basically correct. But we're getting a template is missing error because we haven't created the edit page yet. So, to actually make the edit page, under the Lightsabers Views folder, I'm going to make a new file, edit.html.erb. Right. And to get my edit page going quickly, how about we just take everything in the new page and paste it into the edit page. What I'm then going to change is my heading up at the top. Instead of saying new lightsaber, I'm going to say edit lightsaber. For the form itself, I am going to change nothing. An identical form to what I had on the new page. Down at the bottom where I have the backlink, in addition to that backlink, I'm also then going to put in a hyperlink to go to the show page. I'll say show at lightsaber. Like that. So when I'm editing a lightsaber, if I decide I don't want to edit it, I just want to see it, I can just click that show link to view it. If I pull that up in my browser then, I get my edit lightsaber form. It's already pre-filled with all of the data available for that lightsaber, which in the case of the Windu lightsaber is only a name and a color, the only two required pieces of information. Okay. The submit button down at the bottom has changed, so it says update lightsaber. And this is all from the exact same form that I had for the new page, no difference. I changed the heading at the top and the links at the bottom, but inside the form tags themselves, I didn't change anything at all. Right. The form helpers automatically customize themselves. Stop. Later. Bad timing. Right. The form helper automatically realized, in the case of the edit page, that the lightsaber we were providing for it was a lightsaber that already existed, instead of being a new empty lightsaber. Right. Based on that, it then knew to automatically fill the fields with the value from that lightsaber. It knew to make the submit button say update instead of create. Right. It's brilliant. Super easy to create the edit page, nothing to it. Right. So now we have an edit page and we have a new page. Let me edit. Do I have a picture for Windu's lightsaber? Yeah, it's called mace.gif. Let me edit Windu's lightsaber for the file name. I'm going to put in mace.gif. I'm going to tell it to update. Yep, and now for Mace we've got an actual image. So the edit works. So we've got new, we've got edit. Right? Both of those two parts, though, have the same problem in that neither one of them are doing a very good job at this point of actually showing error messages. Right? When we try to create a new lightsaber, but we don't pass validation because our name's blank or we've selected a bad color, right? It's smart enough to know not to not to create that lightsaber that's invalid. But on its own, it needs to be told more specifically how to show errors. Right? Or does it? Right? Can you spot the subtle difference between a brand new lightsaber form and what it looks like after I try to submit it and it's invalid? Look at the spacing between the name label and the name field. Right now they're very close together. Right? If I say create lightsaber, why is all of a sudden there a bigger gap there? Well, it's actually because there's a little bit of form validation stuff that's getting put into our form for us automatically that's changing that alignment subtly. If we go and we actually take a look at what's happened in there, right, when I tried to submit the new form, but I didn't include a name, the name failed validation. Right? The div, the label and the field itself had a new div wrapped around it that has a CSS class of field with errors. So you remember when I created the form, I put in a div that just had a class of field. Well, when those fields were determined to have problems, the form helpers, when it redisplayed the form, automatically put another div in there around those parts that says field with errors. So I've got field with errors around a label, I've got field with errors around the actual text field itself. Right? Which means I could use those from my CSS to customize how fields with errors actually look. If I go into my assets folder, my style sheets, and open up the lightsabers.css.scss file, the CSS that I've already put in is here. Bit of stuff. If I wanted to, I could come in here and I could do something like, say, in a form, inside something that has an class of field, there could be something that has a class of field with errors. And I could say if that something is a label, then maybe change its color to dark red. The way I'm nesting those tags is because of the SCSS capabilities. If I go back to my browser and refresh, you see name turns red now, color turns red, because of my new CSS rule and the fact that the form helpers are automatically marking those as being problem fields. I could also in here say if there's an input field, then let's say set its background color to that same dark red, and we'll say set its foreground color to white. Oh, sorry about that. If I go back and refresh in the browser again, did I type that color wrong? Oh, I did. I typed it backwards. And I typed it wrong again. There we go. That's what I was looking for. There. So now I'm getting my fields marked as red. The only thing I had to do was actually put in a little bit of CSS to get that to show up. Right? It was being done essentially for me automatically, the marking of the fields themselves in the code. It just wasn't visually apparent until I put a little CSS in for it. Say blah, blah, color of blue. There. I created a blah lightsaber. We're going to have to put in destroy before too long, aren't we?
You went to the photo book?
Sure. The CSS?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. The other thing I'd like to do in the form is instead of just marking fields in a color or in some visual way that are wrong, it'd be nice to show error messages to the user. Some little message up at the top of the form that says, hey, the name can't be blank, or hey, the color has to be within this group, has to be one of these, something like that. Now that's not something that happens for us automatically. Strangely, back in older versions of Rails, it really kind of was. There was just a method you could call, and it would automatically show your errors for you. When they took that out and turned it into something you had to do by hand, it was one of my least favorite changes they've ever made to Rails. I loved the way that it used to just do that automatically. Overall, though, if we wanted it to actually show errors, it's not all that hard of a thing. Do you remember when we were working in Active Record and playing with validations, we saw that inside the Active Record objects themselves, it had an array of errors, right? Where it would keep track of everything that had gone wrong during validation whenever we tried to save. Well, all we have to do here is basically just access those error messages and display them on the form if we want them to be shown. Still having a problem?
Yeah, after putting all that in, it got rid of the table format.
Table format.
Like the way they had the table separated the lines.
On the home page? Did mine? Oh, no, mine's still normal. Huh, let me look again. Probably just curly brace out place somewhere. If you comment down that whole section, your Lightsaber, use different ones. Just highlight that whole section, and then put down command and / command. This one, yeah, there.
I didn't do anything.
Could you re-download the original project and copy out the original copy of the CSS file?
Yeah,
Drop it in place.
Yep, so it's zip for it.
Okay, good. That'd be very convenient. And see if that makes them come back. And yeah, then you can go back to trying to add that little bit of fun. Alright. Okay, so anyway, Active Record already has our error messages stored inside of it. All we really have to do is access them. So if I come back over to my new page, let's say here between the header and the actual top of the form, maybe that's where I want to actually display my error messages. What I could essentially do is I'm going to start off just with an if statement checking to see if there are any error messages. So I'm going to say if the lightsaber we have right now in its errors array, if there are any, then let's say I'm going to put in a div. I'm going to give the div an ID of error explanation. I think that's it. Inside that div, I'm going to put in an H2 header. And inside that H2, what I want to do is show the user a little message telling them about how many errors there are. So I'm going to pluralize from our Lightsaber the number of errors that we get, so the errors count. And I'm going to pluralize the word error. So it's going to say something like 1 error, 2 errors, 3 errors, 12 errors, something like that. And I'll say stopped this lightsaber from being saved. Stopped have 2 P's? Okay. All right. Next, I'm going to create a little unordered list. What I want to do then is I want to loop through all of the errors. So for my lightsaber's errors, inside the errors, there's actually an attribute in there called full messages. And for each one of those full messages, I'm going to create a list item, display that message. So if there are any errors, count how many there are and show the user an error message saying how many errors there are, and then just loop through all of the messages, put them together as a list for the user to see. Back over in the CSS, you might have noticed in there, I already have some CSS code in there for error explanation with an H2 and a UL in it. So this should already be styled. So if I go to my new lightsaber page, I try to create a blank lightsaber. There's my errors up at the top. 2 errors, stop this lightsaber from being saved, name can't be blank, color is not included in the list. If we want validation messages like that on our edit page as well, I could take that little error displaying segment of code we wrote, copy it, I'll take it over to the edit page, paste it in. I might just change my little sentence there, so instead of saying stop this lightsaber from being saved, I'll say stopped it from being updated. If I now go and try and edit one of my lightsabers, I'll edit the blah lightsaber. I'm going to erase its name. If I hit update, name can't be blank, it tells me. So we've got our error messages displaying on our edit page now as well. Nothing to it. What do you think about forms? Do you have questions about them? Rails does a pretty nice job of helping us out, which is nice because forms are so common. They can be so much work, but they're something we use so commonly. It's nice that Rails has gone through quite some lengths to try and make forms a lot easier to deal with. So that's great. Okay. All right. So the two forms we created here for new and edit are both forms that are very closely associated with a particular active record object. What about a form that's not so specifically associated with an active record object? Like, let's say we wanted to include a search feature for our lightsabers. Okay? Maybe something that let us just simply search for lightsabers by color. So I could say, show me all the lightsabers that are blue or all the lightsabers that are green. Something like that. Okay? Well, let's go ahead and make a new page. I'm going to create a new view template inside the lightsabers views folder. I'm going to call it search.html.erb. Okay. Let's see, I'll put in an H1 up at the top that just says search. Down at the bottom, I'll put in a paragraph with a hyperlink in it that'll take me back to the main page. On my index page, I'm going to need a link to take me to the search page. I'm trying to remember what that was. Oh, here it is. I've already set it up. I've already set up the router so that it recognizes that search page. So if we do search underscore lightsabers underscore path, that'll give us the URL to get to that search page. So over on the index page, here it is. Maybe up here at the top before the table, let me put a hyperlink in. Link to search. And then we're going to go to search lightsabers path. On my main page now, I get my little search link that shows up. If I click it, it takes me to the search page itself where I can go back. So that all seems good. What I need then on my search page is I need a form so that we have somewhere to type in the color of lightsaber that we're actually searching for. The trick this time is that this form is not tied directly to a single active record object, a new one that's being created or an existing one that's being updated. Right? This form's kind of more out there just sort of on its own, doing its own form sort of thing. So instead of using form for, like we did previously, there's a different form helper available to us just called form tag. Form tag is very, very much like its HTML equivalent. Remember when you write a form in HTML, you always have to give it two attributes. You have to tell it what URL to submit to and what method to use, usually get or post. Right? Same thing with form tag. First thing I need to do is tell it the URL that it's going to submit to. Now for this URL, I don't have to type the URL out by hand. I can use a Rails helper of some sort in order to get the URL for me. Okay? In this case, the way I have this thing set up is if I submit to lightsabers path, which is basically the home page, that should work. Second thing I then need to tell it is the method, get or post. I'm going to say set the method to get. And again, the form is going to have a block associated with it. So I put a do and end there. If I take a look at my search page now, that gray box is kind of where the form is. We don't have any fields in it yet, but we can certainly inspect it. And I see it's written a form tag for me that has an action of /lightsabers and a method of get. So that looks correct. So there we put together a form that's not associated with one particular lightsaber, but instead, if set up right, should let us search for any lightsaber. We then just need to, inside the form, put in the fields and controls we need. We put in a paragraph. If I want to put in a label, since the label isn't for a particular attribute of a specific object, instead of doing f.label, I can instead say label tag. And it will basically write a label tag for me. I'll say search by color. If I want to put in a text field, instead of f.text field like we did before, instead text field tag. Okay? And I just need to tell it what the field's name is going to be. I'm going to say name the field Q. For a submit button, instead of f.submit, submit tag, and I need to tell it what text to put on the button. So really what the story is we have a lot of the exact same basic methods available when we're not dealing with a form specifically for an active record object. But in this situation, instead of being able to call the method on a particular form that already knows what we're supposed to be building, here instead the f.dot goes away, and instead I have underscore tag at the end of all the methods, and I have to provide them manually with more information. What should the label say? What should the field be called? What text should be on the button? That sort of thing. So there's my little form that I get put together. Nothing too fancy. Now I just have to remember how I set this thing up to work. Let's see. This form is going to submit to the index action of the Lightsaber's controller. So over in the Lightsaber's controller, the index action up here, what it does is, you notice it has that little section in there, params q. That's basically going to retrieve the value that was submitted from our search form. It's then going to use that in a where query, where it's going to look for a color that's like that. Okay? Any lightsabers then that match that will get put into @lightsabers, our array of lightsabers, which will then cause the index view to be displayed again. So our index view, which typically shows all the lightsabers, will instead take on the role of only showing lightsabers that we searched for. At that point, maybe I don't want the search link to show. I think maybe what I'll do there with the search link on my index page is I'm going to say if we have params q, basically if we're searching for something, then show something different. Otherwise, show the search link. And for the something different it's going to show, I think I'm just going to say link to clear search. And I'll just link to Lightsabers path, which will bring us right back to the home page again, but this time with no search query, so we'll end up showing them all. Let's see how that works. On the home page, I click search. I'm going to tell it to search for lightsabers that are green. And it shows me one lightsaber, Yoda's. Something funny happened to my lines there. Probably just bad CSS layout. If I click clear search, it goes back to showing all of them. If I say search for all that are blue, I get all the blue lightsabers back. I think it's working just fine. I can clear the search. One more. Search for purple. We found one, Mace's. Clear the search. That seems okay. Yeah. We've talked about a lot of helper methods in a very short amount of time. All the ones we talked about earlier this week, the image tag, the link to, all that sort of stuff. I real quickly threw in a little bit of information about how the router works. Now we've got all these new helper methods that help us with forms. The fact is, there's just a lot of them. And none of them are probably going to soak in very well until you spend a little bit of time fighting with them. So I'd say practice, practice, practice. Best thing to do. Right? What we'll talk about next time, we're pretty much out of time for today, right, is actually creating our own helpers. Rails comes with lots of good helpers of its own, but it can't cover every possible situation. When they wrote Rails, they had no idea we were going to have to deal with displaying lightsaber images. Right? So we might need the ability to be able to create our own helper to help us out with some of those custom jobs that we need to do. Right? We also want to see if we can go back and maybe dry up our code a little bit. I don't know if it drives you as crazy as I do, but all the copying and pasting I was doing between the edit and the new page, oh, that's an irritation. There's no way those two pages should be that close together and not be able to share some of that code. Right? So we'll see how we can come back and reduce some of this duplication, make the whole thing easier to maintain. Sound like a deal? All right. Hope you all have a good weekend. I'll see you Tuesday.